Church and state. President Joe Biden renews a faith-based office at the White House. What he hopes to accomplish. Impeachment trial verdict. Former President Donald Trump is acquitted. We have a report and reaction. Change of power. Italy welcomes a new prime minister. Learn about his ties to the Vatican. And a new procedure. Why Ash Wednesday will look a little different this year. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 15th, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. President Joe Biden signs an executive order setting up the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He says its mission is to help battle COVID-19, address social issues, and advance global humanitarian work. And tonight there are concerns as well. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. President Joe Biden spent the weekend at Camp David, and he's now back at the White House. And tonight, we're learning much more about his faith-based office. For example, we're told that it will not prefer one faith over another, and that it will not favor religious over secular organizations.
President Joe Biden has signed multiple executive orders in his first weeks in office, the latest forming the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. The White House saying it will, quote, promote partnerships with religious and secular organizations to better serve people in need as our country grapples with a global pandemic, a severe economic downturn, the scourge of systemic racism, an escalating climate crisis, and profound polarization. President Biden knows that civil society partnerships are essential to meeting such challenges, adding, the partnerships office will work to protect the right to practice faith without fear. But there are still concerns about how the Biden administration will handle issues affecting groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor and Catholic adoption agencies.
Right now, we know that there are millions of Americans who have lost their job, who are out of work, and who don't have health care.
Meanwhile, need health insurance or stuck in a bad plan? The Biden administration says a new enrollment window for government insurance markets is now open through May 15th.
We just want to use every tool in the toolkit to make sure that people are covered in the middle of this pandemic.
And on the southern border, news for thousands of people who are waiting to claim asylum. President Joe Biden has promised a more humane approach, but for now is trying to discourage people from coming. On February 19th, the White House says DHS will take steps to begin processing individuals. However,
I will note this news should not be interpreted as an opening for people to migrate irregularly to the United States. Only eligible individuals will be allowed to enter through designated ports of entry at designated times.
Now, while the Biden administration is allowing more refugees in, officials can still kick people out at any time, even asylum seekers. That's because a public health measure involving the coronavirus remains in effect. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Over the weekend, former President Donald Trump was acquitted in his impeachment trial despite 7 Republicans joining Democrats in voting to impeach him. Still, the former president remains very much a topic of discussion on Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with more. Eric?
Well, Tracy, former President Donald Trump thanked the senators who voted to acquit. He said, quote, they stood for the Constitution. Now, some of the 7 Republican senators who voted to impeach, like Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, have already been hit with an official censure from their state party. Well, some of the others are facing a chorus of criticism from local conservatives.
Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty.
A historic weekend on Capitol Hill as President Trump is acquitted for a second time.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
But in the same breath, the minority leader voted to acquit, saying a private citizen cannot be impeached. Democrats disagree.
Trump stormed our house with the mob he incited, and we defended our house.
The former president's defense team says he was not responsible.
The United States Senate decided, as they did, to protect our constitutional way of life and not go down the road of endless impeachments.
After the acquittal, a member of Trump's defense team read a statement from the former president.
We remain one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. And it's our responsibility to preserve this magnificent inheritance for our children and for generations of Americans to come.
As for the 7 Republicans who sided with Democrats to impeach, Senators Bill Cassidy, Ben Sasse, and Richard Burr have or are expected to face censures. Senator Lisa Murkowski is the only one of the 7 up for re-election in 2022. Professor of Christian Social Ethics Julie Hanlon Rubio at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara says what these 7 did is highly unusual in Washington, D.C., voting their conscience over party.
Sometimes there are decisions in history where it really is a question of where are you standing, and it seems to me this was one of those decisions.
South Carolina Senator Republican Lindsey Graham says that the Trump movement is alive and well and that we need President Trump in order to win back the seats in both the House and the Senate in the 2022 elections. The former president says he can't wait. From the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Now, Christopher Bedford, senior editor for the Federalist, joins us now on Skype. Chris, welcome back. Always great to speak with you. We have a lot to get to. But first off, I want to get your thoughts on last week's impeachment trial and former President Trump's acquittal.
The impeachment trial essentially went exactly how we always thought it might go. The second time around, as soon as it began, there was almost no shot possible that the Republicans would join Democrats in impeaching this. And when Mitch McConnell tried to launch a coup mid-January in the pages of the New York Times, leaking that he was open to voting for conviction, he quickly folded on that as Republicans, even more moderate Republicans, started to pull back. Now, I don't really see quite the same level of bravery in these Republican votes as some others have. For example, Burr is looking for a corporate job after this, and this will make him more friendly. In fact, Murkowski is the only person who's going to even potentially face voters ever again or within the next 6 years of anyone who voted. She might face primary trouble. Others have a 6-year platform with which to walk before they're held accountable for this vote, or they're leaving right now. Another takeaway I saw from this is that there was a number of major conservative outlets that at least previously were major that came out hard against President Donald Trump. Probably most notable among them would be National Review. At the end, when you took National Review and you took Liz Cheney, you took Mitch McConnell and others pushing for impeachment either behind the scenes or openly, they weren't even able to get a lame duck senator like Rob Portman, someone who's more moderate. It shows that about 90% of the Republican Party, even on the professional level, still stands with Donald Trump, and he's probably going to be a figure because of that going forward.
And as Eric reported, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell voted to acquit, but said, quote, "There is no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day, referencing that attack on the Capitol." When you heard that, Chris, what did you think, and were you at all surprised by it? And also, what, if any, significance does it hold?
I was surprised by it, mainly because, not because it surprised me that Mitch McConnell might think that, but because he's usually a very careful political player. This was kind of the equivalent of watching a murder-suicide on camera, politically speaking, where Mitch McConnell goes out there. He's not a person accustomed to being pushed back on by his own party. And he even had Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a moderate, hawkish, kind of corporate-leaning Republican, saying, this speech was terrible. He may have gotten something off of his chest, but it's going to be on the backs of Republicans running in New Hampshire, running in Georgia, running in states like Arizona that Republicans hope to win a Senate seat in coming up. Mitch McConnell did this, I think, out of anger somewhat, that his plan was pushed back on. He'd wanted to get rid of Donald Trump as a part of the GOP and move back to some of the policies that he was more comfortable with. The party said no, and he smeared the party as well as the president in this, and expect to see it in 2022 and beyond for anyone running for office.
Yeah, and I was going to actually ask you that, Chris. What do you see as Trump's influence over the Republican Party, now and looking ahead to 2022? And also, what do you think is next for him?
It's hard to say what's next for him. I've heard that he's in good spirits from people who have been speaking to him, which is, you never quite know, especially since he's been less active on Twitter these days. This worked out well for President Trump, or former President Trump, because now he's been acquitted twice. It showed that even Mitch McConnell would be rebuked by his own party, by about 90% plus of his own party, when they try to push back on Trump and his influence, that the voters still support him. And if you look at January donations, for example, to the National Republican Congressional Committee, they were averaging in the $30, even though they raised over $8 million in a post-election month. Now, that's not only a lot of money, but it shows the declining influence of corporate money and a rising interest of smaller donor money in the GOP. That changes who the party is answerable to. It changes who people like Mitch McConnell are answerable to. And those are the people who are motivated by President Donald Trump. It's hard to say whether or not he's going to want to run for president, if he even can, at the advanced age he'll be at in 4 more years. But he certainly will have an influence on candidates. And now he really clearly knows who his targets are in Washington.
All right, Chris, quickly, final thoughts before I let you go.
I think this was an embarrassing moment for the entire Senate. Mitch McConnell stepped into a Democratic trap instead of trying to lead a new party. This will be remembered if the Republicans take back the Senate, which they eventually will, of course, as the pendulum swings back toward it. It was a big mistake, and it was largely an embarrassment for everyone, Democrats and Republicans involved, sadly.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, coping with coronavirus, how the United Kingdom could change its approach to the pandemic, and how Italy's new prime minister is connected to the Holy See. The government in Iraq has imposed new coronavirus restrictions, including closing all houses of worship. The move comes less than 3 weeks before a scheduled visit from Pope Francis. The country's health minister says schools and restaurants will also be closed starting later this week. Most of the measures are scheduled to expire on March 4th. That is the day before the Holy Father arrives in Iraq. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Britain is set to take cautious steps towards easing its COVID-19 lockdown restrictions.
Clearly, schools on March the 8th has for a long time been a priority of the government and of families up and down the country. We'll do everything we can to make that happen, but we've got to keep looking at the data.
The Prime Minister says Britain will be prudent in its next steps. Nearly 1/4 of the population has received their first dose of the vaccine. The Prime Minister of Hungary says his country will start using a coronavirus vaccine developed in China rather than wait for the European Union.
A vakcina nélkül nem tudjuk megállítani a vírust.
Prime Minister Viktor Orban thinks the EU is moving too slowly. He says his plan will allow Hungary to vaccinate millions more people by the end of May. Hungarian health officials also authorized the use of Russia's coronavirus vaccine. And in Romania, around 200,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine were distributed today. The country has received more than 1 million vaccinations thus far. Romania is ranked 3rd in the European Union for doses administered per 100 citizens. Well, Italy is turning a concert hall into a vaccination center. The main musical auditorium in Rome started providing coronavirus immunizations this morning. It previously hosted symphonic concerts and the Rome Film Festival. Now it's welcoming hundreds of Rome residents over the age of 80 to come and get the coronavirus vaccine. Italy appointed a new prime minister over the weekend. Former Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte handed over the bell of power to new Prime Minister Mario Draghi in a traditional ceremony on Saturday. In July of last year, Pope Francis appointed him a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Joining us now for more insight is EWTN News Rome correspondent Colm Flynn. Colm, great to see you. So tell us a little bit more about Mario Draghi.
Good evening, Tracy. Yes, Mario Draghi is Italy's new Prime Minister, and the name may be familiar to many outside of Italy already, as Mr. Draghi is a world-renowned economist who was formerly head of the European Central Bank. In fact, any European currency that was printed between 2011 and 2019 has his signature on it. And at 73 years of age, he was sworn in as Italy's new Prime Minister at a special ceremony on Saturday, along with the 23 cabinet ministers who'll be working along beside him. And Tracy, his big challenge now will be guiding Italy through two crises which are currently crippling the nation. One being, of course, the coronavirus, and the other being the crumbling economy, the worst it has been since World War II. But Italians seem optimistic with his election, and there has been political support for him across the board, given his track record when it comes to finances. He is the man who is credited with saving the euro currency back in 2012. That was during the last global recession, which earned him the nickname Super Mario after the computer game character.
Colm, I want to go back to those challenges that you talked about facing him right now. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Well, Tracy, Prime Minister Draghi and his team will be focused on the two areas that I mentioned, tackling the coronavirus, rolling out the vaccines, and also trying to save the economy. The European Union has granted a $240 billion recovery fund for Italy, and it will be Prime Minister Draghi's task to allocate where that money goes and how it will be spent to keep Italy from falling into a recession. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she wrote on Twitter that Prime Minister Draghi's experience would be an exceptional asset for Italy and for Europe as a whole. And of course, in terms of the coronavirus, Italy continues to be one of the hardest hit countries in Europe. The infection rates continue to be high and the rollout of the vaccine slow.
And something else interesting to note, we also understand that he is a member of the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. What else can you tell us about that?
That's right. Well, it was last July that Pope Francis appointed him a member of what the people call the Vatican's think tank. And this Pontifical Academy was founded by St. John Paul II in 1994 in an effort to promote the study of the social sciences, especially economics, political science, sociology and law. And it is one of several pontifical academies. But Mr. Draghi, just like former Prime Minister Conte, he's a strong Catholic and actually went to a Jesuit school right here in Rome. And today, the head of the Italian bishops, Cardinal Bassetti, he welcomed the new Prime Minister, saying that he is confident that Prime Minister Draghi will give special attention to many Italian families who are suffering greatly from the economic crisis. Now, Italy has been very unstable politically in recent years. For example, Pope Francis has seen no less than 5 prime ministers come and go since becoming Pope in 2013. And at a time like this, with the country facing unprecedented challenges, Italians and Europeans are waiting to see if Super Mario will live up to his nickname. Tracy?
Okay, thank you so much, Colm. We appreciate that.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next, church tradition, how COVID concerns will change the look of Ash Wednesday. And showing God's mercy, what Pope Francis wants priests to know about confession. Well, the Vatican has named a new auxiliary bishop for the Diocese of San Antonio, Texas. Father Gary Janak is a canon lawyer and licensed counselor. The 58-year-old currently works in the Diocese of Victoria in Texas. The Diocese of San Antonio serves more than 1.2 million Catholics. As we draw closer to the beginning of Lent, we now have more on the changes to Ash Wednesday services this year amid concerns related to the coronavirus pandemic. Last week, the Vatican announced modifications to the traditional imposition of ashes seen here. That new guidance directs priests to sprinkle ashes on the heads of the faithful in silence in order to limit physical contact. Joining me now on Skype to talk more about this is Father Thomas Petri, Dean and Acting President of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies. Father, welcome back. Always great to see you again. So on Ash Wednesday, we are accustomed to receiving ashes in the shape of the cross on our forehead. But let's talk a little bit about how the Church has handled the distribution of ashes, that is, historically.
Well, the distribution of ashes to all the faithful actually goes back to the late 11th century when Pope Urban II mandated it for every lay faithful, every lay person on Ash Wednesday. Before that, it was restricted or relegated to a group that we might call the Order of Penitents, those people who had committed serious sins and were expected to do public penance during Lent. They would be crowned with ashes and expelled from the church from Ash Wednesday, do their public penance, receive forgiveness for their sins, and then received back into the church on Holy Thursday very often. That's not, of course, how we do it now. Now we can just go to confession and receive forgiveness of sins. But the imposition of ashes is a very old tradition for Ash Wednesday. It's very scriptural throughout Scripture. Sitting in ashes, rending one's garments is always a sign of penance and a pleading to God for mercy.
For, the faithful who maybe are disappointed or perhaps a little concerned about the changes to what they see as traditional, what would be your message to them?
I would say, firstly, that in the American practice, where we're used to having a cross put on our forehead with ashes at Ash Wednesday, that's not necessarily the traditional practice, and it's not been the universal practice. In fact, in Rome and in many dioceses in Europe and elsewhere in the world, it has been the tradition simply to sprinkle ashes over the crown, over the head, say over the hair of the penitent. I personally have always found it strange that on Ash Wednesday, the gospel is always our Lord in the Gospel of Matthew telling us not to show that we're fasting, not to pray publicly, but to fast and pray privately. And here we're all walking around with crosses on our foreheads. But the Roman custom was always simply to sprinkle ashes over the crown of the head. And there's some scholarship that might suggest this is, in fact, the older practice, that men would generally have gotten the ashes sprinkled on the crown of their head, and that it was women, often because they went to Mass with their head covered, that they were the ones who usually got the ashes smudged or put in the form of a cross on their forehead. So I would say, while everyone is so very concerned about not having the cross on their forehead, and that is a big draw for Ash Wednesday for a lot of people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, remember the point of the ritual, the point of the sacramental, which is to acknowledge our sinfulness, plead before God for mercy, and to begin the spiritual discipline of Lent.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, what's the core of Ash Wednesday and what should be sort of on top of mind as we begin the season of Lent?
Well, especially this year, we're still living in the middle of the pandemic, and the pandemic happened last year right during Lent. At the beginning of Lent is when the coronavirus really took hold of the world. So in some ways, I think it's very easy to feel like we've been in one long Lent. And so now we're starting one again, and it might be easy to let yourself off the hook that I don't have to give something up, or I don't have to do something in addition, because my goodness, it's a struggle just living through this pandemic to begin with. But I would encourage everyone to see suffering and to see the exercises of Lent, what you give up, what you give in alms, the extra prayer time you spend with the Lord, as an offering of the sufferings you endure and you take up, as a way to grow closer to Christ himself, as a token of affection for him, and to unite yourself to his sufferings for us.
Well, thank you so much for that, Father Petri. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Always good to see you, Tracy. Thank you for having me.
And finally tonight, Pope Francis asked the faithful to give a round of applause to priests who show God's mercy in confession.
A questi confessori misericordiosi.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says a good confessor is welcoming and a good listener. Pope Francis also reminds us that Jesus wants to cure us of our sins, and we can do so after going to reconciliation by remaining close to him at all times. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.